Welcome to the AI and Enterprise Forum series. This is an online series that's really dedicated to bring the best practice of AI deployments in enterprises. I'm Kareem Lakhani, for those that don't know me, at the Harvard Business School. I'm also the founder of the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard, also known as LISH. And LISH is where we get all of our cool research done on how innovation works, how science works, and how AI gets developed. This series has come about as a way for us to translate what we know, what we're learning from our research into practice, and to really build a community of practitioners that are interested in thinking about how AI gets deployed inside of industries. And so we care a lot about adoption. We care a lot about how adoption of AI fits within an organization, from its data strategy to project management to product development, and then deployment, of course, in the cloud and so forth. And our hope is that we can both find the best people in the world that are doing this, but then also to create a community of folks interested in getting their own sense of how AI works. I just want to give you a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please, mute your microphones during the talk, and that'll be awesome. Also, you can submit questions you have of the speakers into the chat, and I'll try to get as many of those in, but no promises, because what our speaker is going to present is pretty awesome. Also, we're recording this session both as a video and later as a podcast. And shortly after we end, we'll send you an email with the information about where you can find those recordings. Just also turn your video on. We're not running this as a webinar. We're trying to make it into a community so you can see each other, and I think that's a great way for us to stay engaged and put together. Finally, we want to continue these conversations beyond this event, and so we'll have set up a Slack channel where you can interact with others working on AI in the enterprise settings. Whatever materials that are mentioned in this talk will be posted to that channel, as well as other insightful articles and resources that our LISH team finds between events. And then a follow-up email to today's sessions, which will include instructions on how to join the next set of sessions we have, will also be sent to you as well. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to both have met Reza, but to also introduce you to him. Reza Olfati-Saber is a systems and data scientist with over 25 years of experience in machine learning and applications in life sciences, finance, and technology. He used to make a ton of money working in finance, but then he decided to save lives instead. So we're really glad he has made that transition. He's currently the global head of AI and deep analytics at Sanofi R&D, Sanofi R&D, managing a team of data scientists and life scientists with diverse backgrounds in the US, France, and Germany. Reza received his Ph.D. And SM degrees from MIT in 2001 and 1997. So I just basically we basically touched base in the handoff. So I started my master's at MIT in 97, and I started my PhD at MIT in 2001. So we said hi at graduations and said bye-bye. And he also did his postdoc studies at Caltech. He was an assistant professor of engineering at Dartmouth College, and then from 05 to 12, and then left academia to pursue entrepreneurial passions in AI. He was a senior data scientist at AbbVie, working on biologics, drug design using deep learning. He also served as a chief AI scientist for EY's Advanced Technology Lab with hubs in Cambridge, Mass, and London. He's been the recipient of a PCAS award from President Obama for his pioneering role in distributed decision-making, effective consensus and cooperation in large networks of entities. And his inventions form the foundations of autonomous transportation technology with self-driving vehicles, privacy-conscious learning, and computing. So you can see the guy knows his stuff. And I'm so glad again that he's joined us. So Reza, thank you for joining us, and let's get going with our conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Karim. It's a pleasure to be here. Very happy. Thank you all for attending. It's very happy to see you, all these faces, and we have to get used to the new normal, but we're all trying to do our best under these circumstances. So I'm really happy to see everyone here.
So Reza, why don't you just start your deck, share your presentation, and we'll get going. And you can see Reza is on brand. He's put our logo right up front, so we're very happy.
So I could get us started with some introduction, Karim, if you don't mind. So I'm going to talk about deep digital transformation in pharma. To just start us off, I'll go through a brief history of AI. It's a type of history from really my own lens, and having met some of these cast of characters and having interacted with them, it's definitely has been a privilege. So I think AI really started from ideas turning to science. The science part of it I would call machine learning. Marvin Minsky introduced the first neural network as part of his PhD thesis at Princeton in 1951. And then in 1953, reinforcement learning and dynamic programming were discovered by Richard Bellman, again at Princeton during his PhD, which he did in 6 months. You could tell that he's quite a smart, genius fellow. He was a mathematician and a control theorist, like myself, systems and control theorist. And he worked for years at RAND Corporation doing defense consulting. So in 1969, almost right before 70s, Minsky and Papert published a book called Perceptrons. As my friend Ian Lacombe puts it, it put AI out of business for about 30 years, or 25 years, however you want to count it. But it was essentially a book about a single neuron network and its inabilities to solve complex problems. That actually right now does not come as a surprise whatsoever, but apparently back then they did feel obliged to say that a neural network with one neuron couldn't solve complex classification problems. But to the government at the time and the funding institutions, that meant that this was not real science. As such, they stopped funding AI, and they stopped funding neural networks for a number of years. And those scientists had to get really smart and call their field something else. They called it adaptive filtering, adaptive systems, intelligent systems, a variety of names to get funding in research institutions from NSF and Department of Defense. Came 1982, a friend of mine and the person who hired me at Dartmouth, Sabenko, during his postdoc at MIT, proved that multi-layer perceptrons with many neurons are actually universal predictors. This completely reversed the tide on that winter and brought in the first proof that these things could be used to approximate to actually for modeling purposes. And from that point on, an interest in AI started picking up and machine learning at the same time. In 1995, neurodynamic programming, or application of neural networks to reinforcement learning, was introduced by Sisiklius and Bertsekas, again at MIT. So far, you see that the focus of research is tightly around MIT and Princeton in terms of the innovation. This would change very quickly in the rest of the history. So then deep learning was really born out of introduction of convolutional neural networks by Yan, LeCun, and recurrent neural networks by Schmidhauber and colleagues. Those two are still two core critical network architectures that are driving various modeling applications of deep learning in the world. Belief networks were introduced by Judah Pearl at UCLA, and it was the source of another more Bayesian networks and probabilistic type analysis approaches to machine learning. Both of them were formal basically results. They were not heuristic algorithms whatsoever. So that was just the beginning of it. There's a second phase of applications of AI and machine learning, in which I believe this is the part that science turned into technology. So Bayesian networks were applied to genomics. This was a work by some of the pioneers of genomics as well as machine learning, the probabilistic version of the models. You might know Aviv Regev. She is a legendary genomics scientist who recently left Broad Institute to join Genentech. And Daphne Koller is the CEO of a leading drug design and biologics drug design company in California, and a professor at Stanford. And Nir is Daphne's colleague and Qatar. So one-shot learning was introduced. Just to mention that Daphne is a Stanford professor. Here you would actually see the change of source of innovations coming from other universities as well. One-shot learning was introduced by for computer vision by Fei-Fei Li and Pietro Prona at Caltech, but Fei-Fei Li joined Stanford and was a critical figure in what today is called the deep learning revolution and its impact on computer vision. She was the principal investigator of the famous ImageNet project that brought the power of deep learning into the public through AlexNet. That was it has been heavily cited 67,000 times so far. And I considered that the beginning of deep learning as a technology. This was also coincide with the time that Google decided to go on a shopping spree and hire all of these experts, including Hinton and Ilya Sutskever, who were behind AlexNet, Fei-Fei Li. She was even until very recently the head of their cloud division, and before she sat down and went back to Stanford to pursue other personal interests. Representation learning was born. This turns out to be one of the most important discoveries in the entire history of machine learning. Representations of objects and things that are often inputs of the models were not taken as seriously before that. This for the first time brought the importance of representation of anything from images to words and documents and signals and things like that into attention. And this was done by Tomasz Mikolov at Google when he was at Google in 2013. He is currently at Facebook. So generative learning was introduced by Ian Goodflow and was a student of Benjio and in University of Montreal. He also joined Google later, and the bulk of the applications of generative learning during the initial phase of it, which is between 2014 and 17, was in entertainment and creating like realistic faces and landscape and artwork. I would discuss this later. In 2015, with introduction of Keras by someone that much later joined Google, and popularity of Python, and essentially emergence of open source software as a dominant force in democratization of AI, it actually gave supercharged the AI movement and made it really available for people at large everywhere in the world. So you could have actually done this. You could have implemented your deep learning algorithms, whether you were in the first world country or a third world country, or doesn't matter what world country. So it did not require necessarily significant amount of capital. That soon changed with the need to use faster and faster computing for implementation of deep learning networks. But at the time, it was available, and still it is widely available online to everyone to learn and use. In 2017, Google's AlphaGo managed to beat the #1 Go player in the world using, you guessed it, reinforcement learning and dynamic programming discovered by Bellman in 1953. So as you can see, in history of AI, we frequently actually go back. We frequently go back and see that the work of, this is essentially no different from a fundamental point of view than the work of Sisiklias and Bertsekas in 1995. Actually, I was taking a course with Bertsekas and I had to proofread that book, Neurodynamic Programming. But this is really a neurodynamic programming algorithm. It fits within the same category. Interestingly, Google does not acknowledge that. So as a scientist, I would be actually very happy to see that Google starts acknowledging the fact that what were the true sources of some of these innovation approaches, particularly the role, critical roles of Bellman and other scientists.
Reza, what's interesting about this, was just showing you gave us like a 70-year history, 70-year history of sort of foundational work being done in AI, getting us to where we are. But there's been this massive acceleration over the last 3, 4, 5 years, right?
That's right.
You sort of see going on, and this is sort of this transition from science to technology, broad adoption. But what's been the role of sort of computing power and data becoming available as well in driving this this transition?
Right. So that's a very good point, Kareem. So basically, I can tell you that I was implementing multi-layer neural networks 25 years ago for speech recognition. So it could be done. There was no standard technology. There was no standard set of libraries that everybody could come up with basically a repeatable solution for something. And then the computational power was definitely very helpful. I had to leave my neural networks to train in 1995 for 1 week on MIT's networks, and MIT didn't have slow computers at the time. It did have some of the best computers and work.
Did you take a coffee break in between? Did you take a week off while you're
No, I put a note on the thing saying that please do not touch this. This is running a week long, training neural network training experiment or whatever.
What's
And I
interesting,
usually,
what you've said is actually what's interesting is that there's this shift from a craft basis, like it's in academic labs, it's PhD students, postdocs, toiling away, working away in the basements, to now it becoming like off the shelf. Like so we see the shift from a craft base to an industrialized base.
absolutely, and it's widely available almost everywhere in the world, regardless of the level of capital and income. So that's actually a huge factor. So it is truly democratized by now. And I have to give big tech giants that popularize some of these platforms and open source software credit, because it's actually it's non-trivial that you could actually open source a software and benefit from it.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, they managed to do this. In fact, some of the founders, particularly the Facebook founder, was very difficult. It was very difficult to convince him that open source software had any value. He would simply not accept it, and then later on, just trusted the fact that Google did it. So let's just give it a try, and maybe PyTorch would become popular, and it became popular, and they would get credit for it. So all of these, there's definitely something to gain by making any platform or method scalable and widely available. I have to say that NVIDIA chips, GPUs, TPUs, they didn't hurt. They actually significantly contributed to all of this and this kind of momentum, to a point that more recently, using transfer learning and transformer models, you would actually need, it would cost you $500,000 to teach or to train a very accurate language model on all kinds of text, massive amount of data within hours. So it's actually not cheap to build some of these transformer models. And there are teams that actually make all of those models open source. So you could actually use that pre-trained model and benefit from it without paying the $500,000 fee.
The other thing I want to reflect on here, Reza, before we move on to the main part of your talk, which is that, and when we met before, we were joking about this, that like in fact, the first type of exposure people have to machine learning is a logistic regression or linear regression, right? And that was invented by Galton in the 1800s. And so as I look at this timeline, what I see is that the most recent developments, generative learning, transfer learning, this combination of RL and dynamic programming, those have just been figured out. But the gains to companies today have been using the older AI stuff. So it seems exciting to see that these new developments, when they sort of get out of the labs of Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and Baidu and Alibaba, and are become widely available, that the capabilities that the economy will have access to is going to be quite interesting.
Yes, I completely agree. And one of the facts that anyone that works in the industry across multiple sectors would realize is that 90% of the type of AI problems that the enterprise needs can be actually resolved using much simpler, less advanced levels of machine learning and AI.
Yes.
The one thing that I have noticed from the very beginning when I started working on biotech and pharma problems was the degree of complexity that it took for the models, and just the performance of those basic statistical models were simply not good enough you did have to be very innovative and come up with much more advanced algorithms. And the bulk of what you see that's been recently discovered is incredibly, I'm going to give you a sense of that during the actual presentation, but you will see it in the use cases in pharma, but the bulk of these things have really enormous applications in biomedicine today.
Great.
So to give you a sense of applications of AI in pharma, I tried to show from the beginning to the end the entire pharma value chain. As you can see, this is the drug discovery and development is a really multi-stage process, or it's made out of a chain of processes that the first parts have to do with identification of targets for a drug, and then designing the drug, and then doing some initial proofs of concepts of safety and efficacy of the drug. And then it gets to a set of phases of clinical trials. An initial part of it in a smaller scale experiments is called early development, and the larger scale ones are called the actual development. Obviously, there are regulatory issues, and there would be launch and marketing and other aspects that, from a business perspective, would be necessary after the drug is approved. AI has applications in every single one of these processes. And by deep digital transformation, I truly mean that a digital pharma company would have digitized and transformed almost every single one of these processes from the beginning to the end, including this, the supporting administrative kind of processes for this actual discovery and development, including like HR, finance, and so on, commercial aspects. And so all of those have to be fully transformed for this to become a very efficient and agile and precise pipeline. I've mentioned, I've basically listed some of the use cases of AI in pharma, from genomics and proteomics and metabolomics, basically calling it multi-omics type analysis that is often done for drug discovery, to in silico drug design and precision medicine, in modeling of clinical trials, digital health, and a number of other applications. All of these are possible applications of AI. One thing that is important to know is the business aspect of this chain. So if you pay more attention to early development to late development from the orange section and forward, the chance that a molecule or drug entering phase 1 clinical trial in immunology, a drug that addresses an immune disorder type of problem, such as rheumatoid arthritis, make it to the final phase 3 and regulatory approval is 15% currently. This entire process takes about $1 billion alone and higher. So you're investing $1 billion on something that has a 15% chance of success. That's a pretty high risk investment. Now, what is the reward? The reward is that if you come up with something like Humira from AbbVie, it would sell $20 billion per year. That is not true about all biologic drugs, but it's true about many of them, meaning that you would be actually their sales figures are in the order of multiple $billion per year. So yes, you're investing $1 billion in this process, and the process is not perfect. It has a probability of success of 15%, but the return could be huge. Now, from an investor perspective, if I put my head from a finance perspective behind, is that my first question as an investor would be, how can I actually reduce the risk? Is there any way to improve the probability of success? My answer to that is that what AI is doing in pharma today is precisely that. This 15%, if 15% becomes 50%, with a diversified portfolio, you could actually make the system far more efficient and de-risk it a lot more. So if that increases to 75% probability of success, it's pointless to mention how good of a system you would have. And it's actually a much faster and a much more agile system that would address a larger number of unmet needs for the patients. The issue is not simply the business aspect or how much you invest and how much you return from this. The real issue is that this entire process takes 10 years and $2 billion. How can we actually reduce that to 6 months, to 1 year? And that actually, for the very first time at the time of COVID-19, became a reality that we had to develop a vaccine as soon as possible to accomplish that, irrespective of cost and any kind of financial calculation on this. This is basically something that is so critical that would really save lives and would save the global economy as well.
Yeah, Reza, and I think just to reflect on that, I mean, I think what you've laid out is a typical pipeline we see in pharma, right? And I think what your argument is like, look, we can apply AI at scale across all of these things, and AI hopefully should both speed the process, but also improve accuracy for us,
yes,
right? Across the board. And I think what's so amazing right now in this terrible time of this global pandemic is that assumptions we've had in a whole range of industries about how digital they can be, right, and how AI can be helpful are being turned upside down, because the emergency is causing us to, think about our processes, our approaches in a totally different way, driving this acceleration. And I guess the interesting thing would be to sort of see, how do we actually, create these new processes that are sort of digital and AI infused from day one, instead of sort of doing it after the fact.
Right, and not that this is an industry that has a long history. It's practically impossible to do it for the older big pharma companies. They have to go through this transformation. But the new generation of startups and biotechs that are being developed, they actually have the opportunity to completely do this right from the very beginning. There is absolutely no reason to use a traditional and mostly manual type of process,
yes,
even though if it's cheaper somehow
yes,
initially. So what you said is what I believe most new companies should be doing.
Yes.
And should be part of their objective.
Yeah.
And for the more traditional companies, this is an unavoidable change, because the previous business model, in my opinion, is not sustainable. Yeah. And I'm not the only one saying that, but the rest of people would definitely, particularly in your fields in business.
Yeah, I have a whole book about that. Yes. But Reza, we have 25 minutes left, and we've got lots more slides. So let's go and show them the real cool stuff you got here.
Okay. So I picked the digital drug design. This was an area that I worked on since 2014. And I picked that too as an example of what are the technologies that had come together to actually transform the drug design part alone. So that would be only one of those blocks. So if we look at the market landscape for two types of drugs, small molecules, which are often in the form of pills, and biologic drugs that are often injected to the patient. If you look at that, the current market for small molecules is in oncology is roughly around $63 billion, and in biologic drugs, it's twice of that. And the growth rate, the annual growth rate of this over the next 5 years is going to be almost twice for the biologics compared to the small molecules. Both of them have thousands of, are being used in thousands of clinical trials and have a lot of potential. But as an investor, I would invest at a 2-to-1 ratio in these two areas. That should be particularly true for larger pharma companies. And that is certainly currently not true in the VC investment community and private equity and other aspects, because there are about 750 companies that are funded with comparable raises at the seed or other follow-up runs. In small molecules, there are about 750 startups, and there are 120 startups in the biologics. Though when you look at the total amount of raises in the biologics side, you would see that they're actually 2 to 10 times larger than the left-hand side. So there is an imbalance currently in the world in terms of investment in these two areas, but I think that should shift to a 2-to-1 ratio, at least based on current figures. So I'm going to focus on computational design of antibodies. So the first generation of antibody drugs came up about 45 years ago, and they started by discovering these antibodies by injection or immunization of animal models. That's the in vivo discovery era, and that started to change, and other types of lab-based experiments were actually added with the introduction of in vitro era, and that was when large immune libraries and so on could be designed. And the final aspect, or the final revolution, or in silico, started pretty much about 5 or 10 years ago, and it hasn't been that long. And the necessity of moving to fully computational, and I could tell you without exception, this is going to be machine learning based or statistical in nature without exception. So it's not just computational in general, but AI is the key tool being used there. Is the real reason for it is that trial and experiments is practically impossible to satisfy so many desirable physiochemical properties of proteins. If you just randomly make a little bit of changes and then again experiment, make some changes, learn from your mistakes and make more experiments, this could be an incredibly lengthy design cycle that's highly costly, and that's how things work traditionally. So you have to do many runs of iterations to come up with a more optimized drug, and use a small number of those in your initial clinical trials or early development. Now, the role of deep learning in the past 5 years, I could say, has been that it has significantly improved the speed of drug design, and the performance of achieving those desirable properties. So this is really from a business perspective or operations research perspective is really solving a very complex multi-objective optimization problem that is combinatorial in nature. So these tools are, the deep learning tools, the role of deep learning tools is that they have been very effective predictors. Now, given the fact that proteins actually do have sequences, there's protein sequences that represent antibodies, you could fully represent an antibody with a set of 6 critical sequences of proteins. And Francis Arnold, who is a Nobel laureate in 2018 in chemistry and a legendary scientist from Caltech, was one of the first to propose embedding or representation of antibodies using natural language processing. Methods that came completely from outside of her field. Keep in mind that she's a chemist and not exactly an NLP expert, and she doesn't work on text analytics and doesn't know perhaps about most of the advances that happened in that area in processing of documents and applications of AI in documents. But the techniques that actually became, the discovery that became very critical in this work was the representation learning of Mikolov from Google. So that invention that was incredibly helpful in NLP actually is going to significantly impact not only design of antibodies, but design of small molecules. And I can't expand that too much, but in my view, it would impact gene therapy as well. So other modes of therapy as well.
So Reza, connecting to our earlier discussion, how does this both speed up time and also increase accuracy in the biologic space?
I see. So you would. So the way it speeds of time is that you would do the entire, instead of doing actual experiments in the lab or immunization of animals, you would basically simulate this whole thing, but you would run 10,000 simulations in parallel or 100,000 experiments in parallel, or a larger number of experiments based on your computational power. And that would actually help you do fully in silico screening of potential drug candidates rather than experimenting with each and every one of them, which would be very lengthy and costly. So you could actually do entirely the whole thing in a computer.
Interesting, great.
And if you build a very powerful modeling pipeline, instead of waiting months to discover, as soon as you have a virus, the virus is the input of your pipeline, and the neutralizing antibody is the output of your pipeline. And if we do it in a matter of essentially seconds and minutes and things like that, and then you have to validate that experimentally.
Of course. Yeah, I think that's been the case for both what Moderna has done, with their mRNA technology, and the Bion as well, which is a German equivalent, also doing mRNA in the same way. So
yes, so at those are methodologies that heavily rely on the fact that they already have designed a fully digital pipeline. Therefore, they're going to be very efficient in this, or at least most of it is digital. Meaning that there is an unavoidable wet lab aspect of this, that you have to make those antibodies and characterize them. But the parts that can be computationally done is most likely are being computationally done. So, currently there are a number of teams that claim they have successful approaches to design of therapeutic antibodies. And I've named a number of these groups. Obviously, there are very leading researchers at Harvard, MIT, Oxford, and a number of other national labs and startups that claim to be very successful in this. But to bring all of this together, really digitalization of drug design took 5 major innovative technologies. In 2018, which was a very critical year for antibodies in general and for AI, Nobel Prizes in chemistry and medicine were given to pioneers of protein engineering. And the coming together of next generation sequencing, high throughput screening, and immune checkpoint modulation, which is a very powerful method of therapy in immuno-oncology, together with advances of deep learning and high performance computing, really enabled emergence of this digital drug design type of platform. It wasn't a single element, it was a combination of these elements. And quantum computing is going to have a role in that in the future. It's just currently the number of qubits of quantum computers is just not very sufficient to design a realistic protein or antibody at this stage. But as you can see, the tech giants are heavily invested in that and are pushing way ahead with their programs. It's not sometimes it's the next generation of those GPUs and TPUs that you're looking at.
So Reza, let's pause for a second. We have 12 minutes. We may not be able to get to your second example. So I think it'd be good for us just on this slide. I want to get some of the questions from our participants as well, from our audience.
Sure, I'd be happy to hear that.
One thing that's so interesting is when was the last time you took a biology course, like formally?
Formally, I took a biology course was in high school.
In high school, okay. Same as me. So what are you doing driving AI in a biology company? Right?
Good question.
Like undergraduate, graduate biology, like it seems ridiculous, right? That you with no biology background are in a Sanofi, right? Driving drug development, drug design with zero background in biology. So help
it's impossible. Practically, it's impossible. And
I know you're a smart guy, but still.
Yes. Well, I could reveal a little bit of a personal secret, Karim, that I finished my high school a little bit early. So while I had time, I decided that, my dad decided it would be a great idea if I go to medical school.
Yes.
Like many other Persians. And I was like, okay, sure, why not? And so I heavily studied really advanced biology, biochemistry, chemistry, you name it, at an advanced level, which was early years of college.
Yes.
Towards the end, I decided that because I was actually too good in math, it would be a waste of
time. Yes, exactly. Biology was a descriptive.
I was like,
descriptive.
Sorry, Dad, sorry to disappoint you, but I've decided to actually go and study.
And so maybe talk about this, right? So, and this is a question that Amanda has asked in our chat as well, which is to say, like, how does because this applies not just to to pharma companies and biotechs, but more generally, how do we think about expertise that people have, deep expertise they have in an industry, in a technology, in an approach, with bolting on sort of this AI sensibility of statistics and large scale data analysis, and so forth. So why don't you maybe just give us your perspective of how this tension between deep vertical expertise people may have is going to be combined with the statistical and computation prowess of AI systems?
Great question. So this is actually a challenge for any manager in AI that is trying to build a successful team in a life sciences company or biotech company that applies AI, which traditionally comes from computer science and engineering and management, and then with something that is fundamentally biological in nature and medical in nature and chemical in a sense. So My own experience has been that both groups have to try to learn the language of the other team. So it's both both groups have to become bilingual. So people who actually have more of a math physics type of background and engineering and science that is not life sciences have to actually try. I did have to do a lot of self-study. I worked with a lot of biochemists and chemists and bioinformaticians and others, and colleagues were incredibly supportive. They tried to learn my field. I tried to put together simple tutorials to teach my colleagues on the other side. Keep in mind that the head of oncology of a major drug company is not going to simply accept your AI-based design drug. The first thing he told me was, prove it. This was in AbbVie. Prove it that this works. And you have to have a proof of concept the same way you do that in a startup, or you have to have an MVP version of your platform and have to actually prove to them that this can be done. And then they would believe you, and then they devote resources to it. They would be much more willing to actually learn your area or learn about it. So it's a cultural awareness that has to go both ways, in my opinion.
Great, great. So maybe, Reza, just let's go to your conclusion slide. And I've got a couple more questions to ask you from our audience as well. I mean, again, we could be spending 3 hours with you together going through these amazing experiences. One question I do have, which I really like, is from Sudarshan. He's asking, you know, will the pharma companies mostly be users of these algos that are developed at universities and at the GAFAs of the world, the Googles, the Facebooks, Alibabas of the world? Or do you imagine a time when, in fact, sort of the breakthroughs in algorithmic work is actually going to come from pharma companies too? What's your sense about that?
The reality is that the breakthroughs are going to come from the pharma companies. The off-the-shelf algorithms will be almost useless for you because they never consider realistic settings that you're facing in pharma. None of that. So
are you guys publishing then? Are you following the things that Google does and so forth, and actually publishing these algorithms, making them open source so everybody else can benefit from that as well?
No.
Okay.
We really can't. At least there is no willingness at this point. However, I think there could be willingness, and I'm hopeful that with advances that would happen in federated learning,
yes,
there are collaborative consortiums of pharma companies. They do trust each other. They work very closely with each other because this is a huge investment, and it's much easier for 8 or 10 companies to take those challenges.
But you would think that it'd be the same thing like saying, oh, Google's only going to work with Facebook, right? And we'll share between us, versus just releasing it to the world and getting everybody else to work on that, really accelerated the deployment. So I think it's anyway, we can talk more about that.
There are actually aspects of that, Kareem, that are publishable.
Yes.
There are aspects of that are publishable. There are certain proprietary or confidential aspects that are not publishable, and you can't get the executives of any of the pharma companies to reveal to any other ones what those specific. And that was very much true in finance when I was experiencing that.
Same issue. Yeah, exactly.
It was exactly the same. So you do have some of your own know-hows that you can't really share and is your own IP, but there are certainly aspects of that that can be shared.
But it runs so counter. Yeah, I totally get it. It runs so counter to the culture there. And I want to ask another question that Rory has asked here, which I think is great. And I think you addressed that in your third bullet point as well. But like if I'm a O-line pharma executive, I'd done sort of, small molecules, and then I sort of had to get my head around biologics and so forth. Here you come, Reza, with this fancy MIT Ph.D. in AI, and now you're going to tell me how to run my business and how how AI is going to revolutionize what I thought would take 10 years and $1 billion and 15%. So how are they thinking about these investments? How are they thinking about, in your experience, this shift, which it seems necessary and important to actually make that happen? Because part of what we're sort of seeing about AI deployment in enterprises is really sort of like, how do we change the mindset of executives and people in positions of power to sort of make the investments in the data pipeline, make the investments in the people, make the investments in the processes to make this work. So what's been your experience around that?
My experience has been that 5 years ago, that wasn't the case, meaning that they would be very receptive. I can't name names and I won't, but you could assume that these are top executives in charge of some of the leading pharma companies internationally, and they would simply not be willing to invest in AI to that degree that, let's say, I want it. Or I would advise them as a consultant because they view that as a loss in their bottom line, and that's just an expense, and they don't see a real return from it.
Yes.
So things are working fine for them as is. But then you see that suddenly, Apple would come up with iPhone and completely disrupt the mobile phone industry.
Yes, my book mentions that as well. Yes.
Yes, and then they go completely out of business.
Yes.
Then they realize that, oh, this is actually an existentialist kind of threat, and now many of them are actually becoming AI savvy and digital savvy. They're actually becoming very open. I was very happy to see that our new CEO at Sanofi was very pro-digital, and he essentially asked us to go check out some of the digital resources right after the work from home started and the pandemic situation and the crisis started. He was like, you definitely use this opportunity to familiarize yourself with more digital tools and digital approaches. So in some companies, you have to fundamentally fight against the old-fashioned culture. In some companies, they've already moved on.
Yes.
They're bringing up fresh minds. They're heavily investing in it. Yes. And, I would invest in those companies. Yes. I wouldn't invest in the old-fashioned ones that are following the previous 30-year trend and so on.
So hey, we have 1 minute left. I want to also just call out Brian Calvanese has said in the chat that if you want to recruit an executive sponsor, do a small pilot and show value, right? But you have to show value, which is very important. And then also, I would add to that have a plan for scaling. Right? I think a lot of enterprises get stuck at pilots and don't know how to scale. So if you're going to do a pilot with an executive, get them to commit to also figure out how you're going to scale this if you're going to deliver value. And then, or of course, the easy one is also show that a competitor is applying AI in your space. And so look, Reza, this has been so fascinating to get your inside view about how one of the most important industries in the world for humanity is changing. Certainly, we've all become attuned now to the importance of the pharmaceutical industry, of the computational, of the biotech industry, and its implications for public health. And it's so amazing to sort of see your journey through this and your leadership in this space. So I want to thank you again for your time to sort of let both our immediate audience know as well, but hopefully our future listeners for this. And we hope to get you to come back because again, we could spend another 2 hours, 3 hours to both learn from you, both on the technology side, but also really like how you build the organizations to make this work.
Thank you so much, Kareem, and the team at Harvard Business School and Leish for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and the audience for being very patient and asking really good questions. Of course, as a former professor, I just talk a lot, so I apologize for that. But
You have a lot to tell us. No, we have a lot to learn. So,
I'd be happy to come back and have more chats in the future.
Thank you so much again. Thanks everybody for joining in. Please stay safe. Mask up, everybody, and we'll be seeing you around online on our Slack community. And thank you to the Lish team, Jenny, Tim, Hannah, for making this all work for us. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll be in touch. Take good care.